Right now, people are injecting themselves with peptides to heal injuries faster, gain muscle, lose fat, sleep better, and even supposedly slow down aging. And the weirdest part is that the idea isn't completely ridiculous. Some of the best medicine ever made are peptides. Insulin is one, GLP-1 drugs are another. But that scientific credibility is now being borrowed to sell something very different. For most of these drugs, there isn't a single human clinical study. For others, the human evidence consists of tiny, short, preliminary experiments that are really not worth much. Meanwhile, they're being marketed online like we already know what they do. But there is one peptide in this story that is being developed very differently, with huge, proper phase 3 clinical trials, and I'm actually very excited about it. First, when I say peptide, I'm not talking about every peptide drug. There are hundreds of legitimate peptide based medicines. I'm specifically talking about the new wellness slash research only peptide market. BPC 157 for healing, TB 500 for recovery, MOTS-C for metabolism and longevity, KPV for inflammation, epithalon for anti-aging, DSIP for opioid withdrawal, chronic insomnia and narcolepsy, Semax for cognition and neurological effects. These became so popular that in July 2026, an FDA advisory committee was asked whether 7 of these experimental peptides should be allowed to be made by compounding pharmacies. Compounding pharmacies prepare customized medications for individual patients when an appropriate FDA approved product isn't suitable or available. And once you look at the evidence that the FDA scientists reviewed, things get weird very quickly. Where are the human trials? This is probably the most important part. Because online, these compounds are often discussed like we already know what they do. But for most of these peptides, the human evidence ranges from extremely limited to practically non existent. FDA staff went through the available evidence and actually recommended that all 7 substances being considered should not be added to the 503A compounding list. Now, that doesn't mean that the FDA proved that these medicines don't work. No. Absence of evidence is not evidence that the drug is useless. Some of these compounds might eventually become genuinely useful medicines. But that's exactly why we have clinical trials. You start with cells, then animals, then early human safety studies, then larger controlled trials to find out whether the benefit is actually real, how large it is, what dose works, and what the adverse effects are, and what happens when thousands of different human beings take it. You don't normally jump from, oh, this did something interesting in a rat, to here's a vial, injected. And yet, this is basically where most of the peptide industry is at today. Take BPC 157. It's probably the most famous one. It's sometimes called the Wolverine peptide because it's marketed for tissue repair and injury recovery. There is interesting preclinical non human research, but the human data? In 2025, we finally got a published human IV safety study. Great. How many people? Two. Two people, both of whom had already received IV BPC 157 before the study. They got 2 infusions and were followed for roughly 3 days. That's the study. This is insane compared to what data you would normally expect before confidently marketing a drug for widespread therapeutic use. And that's the recurring pattern. The biological idea might be interesting. The animal data might be interesting, but somewhere between interesting and proven medicine, the internet has skipped about 10 steps. These unknown effects on humans genuinely matter. One thing BPC 157 does in animal studies is promote angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels, which is how it helps injured tissue recover. Sounds great, but angiogenesis is something that tumors can exploit to grow their blood supply. So what happens if someone taking BPC 157 has an early cancer they don't even know about? Does it worsen it? Does it accelerate it? We genuinely don't know because those studies have not been done. And that is exactly the point. When people are injecting these things to themselves without medical supervision and tests, they are betting that the only biological effects are the biological effects that we like. They're not. And then there is the second problem. Assume I'm completely wrong. Assume that BPC 157 turns out to be fantastic. Assume 10 years from now on we run properly randomized trials and it turns out it really does improve some sorts of tissue healing. There is still another problem. What exactly are you injecting today? Because when you're buying something online from a website selling research peptides, you're not only betting on the molecule, you're betting on the manufacturer. Is that actually BPC 157? Is it the amount written on the label? How pure is it? What else is present from the manufacturing process? Was it produced and stored correctly? Is it sterile? Was it properly tested for bacterial endotoxins? These aren't theoretical concerns. Researchers purchased illicit peptide products from the internet suppliers and found major variation in drug content, purity as low as 5%, and excessive levels of elemental impurities, including arsenic in several samples and lead in one. The FDA has also separately raised concerns about peptide related impurities and inadequate or missing bacterial endotoxin testing for these sources. Endotoxins in your blood can cause fever, chills, low blood pressure, and even septic shock, potentially fatal. So now we have two separate problems. We don't really know what these molecules do in humans, and you don't even know what you really have in those vials. And this market has developed one of the strangest pieces of legal looking theater imaginable, for research use only, not for human consumption. And then underneath that, a website telling you exactly how many milligrams are in the vial, people discussing injection protocols, influencers talking about their stack. It's insane. And here's where it gets interesting. The FDA story. On July 23 and 24, FDA's Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee considered 7 of these peptides for possible inclusion on something called the 503 bulk list. That list matters because under specific circumstances, substances on it can be used by licensed physicians or pharmacists to make custom compounded medicines. FDA's own scientists reviewed all of the evidence and proposed none of the 7 to be added. Then the advisory committee voted, and they recommended 6 of those 7 substances to move toward broader compounding access. So, FDA scientists, don't add them. Advisory committee, add 6 of them. Before we get into why, let's understand what they actually voted for. No, FDA has not approved these peptides. One final distinction, because this is going to get butchered online. The advisory committee's vote is not FDA drug approval. It isn't even the final FDA decision on whether these substances enter the 503A bulks list. The committee advises FDA, but the FDA makes the regulatory decisions. And even if one of these substances eventually moves to the 503A bulks list, that does not mean that it's FDA approved. The FDA explicitly says it does not review compounded drugs for safety, effectiveness, and quality before marketing in the same way as it reviews approved drugs. So, allowed to be compounded does not mean FDA proved it works, and it does not mean FDA proved it's safe. Those are very different statements. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Analysts cited by Reuters estimate a peptide market of roughly $2.2 to $3.3 billion, and companies including Hims are already preparing peptide offerings and doing testing work involving BPC 157 while waiting for regulatory decisions. Interestingly enough, Reuters reported that 7 people added to the advisory committee before the vote are connected to the peptide industry business. They operated or worked for clinics or businesses selling peptide treatments. Now, that doesn't prove corruption, but it does show something interesting. All of the members with peptide industry backgrounds and connections voted yes on all of their votes, while rather academic background members voted no. It's astonishing. It's reasonable to look very closely at how that decision was reached. Okay, before we get into this part, I am apologizing that I am going to be butchering these names. Look just at the 7 people that have proven peptide industry connections. This was the only non-yes vote on these 7 people that have proven peptide industry connections. Meanwhile, let's look at the other members. So, the 7 with documented industry connections. Gabriel Alizadi. FDA lists him as scientific director of Maximus Health. We know that Maximus operates in the peptide space and cites Alizadi describing his work as covering peptide therapy and writing publicly about BPC 157 and the PCAC process. There is also a Maximus article stating the company was preparing to offer BPC 157 if a complaint pathway opened. Christian. He founded Aether Medicine, which is described as a longevity or regenerative practice whose programs use peptide protocols and which specifically advertised BPC 157 and TB 500. Halem Mohammed. He was Global Chief Medical Officer of Game Day Men's Health. Game Day offers peptide treatments, and according to a CLC complaint, He had responsibility for peptide protocols and the relationships with compounding pharmacies. Chris Wusterheisen. He founded the Research Clinic, which offers hormone and peptide treatments. His FDA resume also identified him as an educator in peptide therapy, and the CLC complaint documents lectures in which he discussed BPC 157 and other peptides. During the meeting, he referenced his own experience seeing BPC 157 used. Bobby Harshbarger. He is a pharmacist and operations manager at his family's premier pharmacy, which provides compounding support and sells compounded medicines for areas including longevity, weight loss, and pain. Joshua Starbuck. He owns McKenna Health, a functional medicine practice. Its website advertised peptide therapy and said he prescribed compounded peptides through 503A compounding pharmacies. Melissa Luzeke. She founded Renew Institute, a wellness clinic offering peptide therapy, and her resume listed consulting relationships with other clinics involving peptide therapeutics. Now, there actually is an interesting argument for adding them to the list. It goes something like, these people are already using these peptides. Banning them from pharmacy compounding doesn't make the demand suddenly disappear. Instead, people buy them through unregulated online markets, sometimes from foreign or unknown manufacturers with bad purity and major contamination concerns. So, supporters argue, if people are going to purchase and inject BPC 157 anyway, wouldn't we rather them get it from a licensed compounding pharmacy? A pharmacy can offer better traceability, quality controls, and maybe even some level of regulatory oversight. One committee member summarized the argument essentially as, we are not approving a drug. We are trying to move a decision patients are already making into a system with rules. I mean, I get it. Harm reduction is a real public health concept. There are situations where supplying a safer version of something people will use anyway can reduce harm. But that only fixes one of our two problems. Remember our two problems? One, what is in the vials? And two, does the drug work? What does it do? And what are its effects and safety? Moving these from a sketchy online seller to a competent pharmacy could substantially improve the first problem. But what does that tell us about whether years of BPC 157 exposure is safe? Nothing. What does it tell us about whether it actually heals human tendons? Nothing. What does it tell us about uncommon adverse effects that might only appear after thousands of people use it? Nothing. Cleaner experimental medicine is still experimental medicine. And this is where I think the people are using it anyway argument becomes really dangerous if allowed to replace the normal standard of evidence. Because the normal answer to millions of people want this drug and we don't know whether it works should be run the trials, not find a cleaner way to sell it first. If companies can manufacture and sell these peptides as bulk ingredient into a profitable compounding market without anyone having to complete the clinical development program normally required for the FDA approval, who is left with the financial incentive to spend millions proving whether it actually works? Why run the trials and risk finding out it doesn't work while you can sell it right now? This decision substantially worsens our second problem. So, what does the normal drug development process look like? For comparison, look at another experimental peptide drug, retatrutide, because it's actually going through the normal drug development process. Lilly is studying it in large phase 3 clinical trials for obesity and related disease, with plans to seek FDA approval. So here we have the pharmaceutical company that developed the molecule saying, we are still studying it, and meanwhile, people are already selling retatrutide online. In August, Lilly sued 6 companies it accused of selling black market versions of retatrutide while the actual drug is still in phase 3 development. Think about how backwards that is. The company developing the drug is still running controlled trials before asking regulators permission to sell it, while random online websites apparently decided that they could just skip those steps and start selling it. So, I'm actually pretty excited about retatrutide because the results of these trials are looking pretty good. Anyways. Maybe BPC 157 is amazing. Maybe TB 500 will eventually become a useful medicine. Maybe some of these peptides that people are self-injecting today will become genuinely useful medicine 10 years from now. I genuinely hope they do. The problem isn't that experimental medicines exist. Experimenting is how medicine is advanced. The problem is pretending that the experiment is over, or worse yet, running the experiment on the public. Seriously. People who are self injecting these vials without medical supervision are effectively taking part of an uncontrolled experiment, one with no protocol, no systematic follow up, and no one collecting the data. We are not sure what will happen to these people, but I guess we will see. Right now, we're watching compounds move from animal studies to real world widespread human usage with a potentially multi billion-dollar market behind us before even some of the most basic questions have been answered. Giving an experimental drug a cleaner vial doesn't answer those questions, it just gives the experiment better packaging. Let's just hope that this situation will be handled with care and correctly, and see you guys in the next video.